The last chapter of Year of Doom 1975 in America, North America, called it The Inside Story of Jehovah's Witnesses, and he's entitled this chapter, Whither the Witnesses, written from the standpoint of 1966-67, what's going to happen to them after 1975 goes by. In attempting an answer to the question as to what future there might be for Jehovah's Witnesses as a religious movement, I have found it helpful to look back to the early days of the movement at the close of the the last century, and to read some of the writings of Pastor Russell. The pattern of the past usually provides some clues to the pattern of the future. In the third volume of Studies in the Scriptures, entitled Thy Kingdom Come, Pastor Russell outlined his chronological calculations by which he had arrived at the conclusion that the year 1914 would see the end of all kingdoms and the full establishment of the kingdom of God. The calculations were based on the 11th and 12th chapters of the book of Daniel, and by referring to the prophecy, which relates the long drawn-out struggle between the king of the north and the king of the south. The present-day interpretation of this is outlined in chapter 4. Russell arrived at the conclusion that the time of the end began in the year 1799 and would end in 1914. He believed that Daniel chapter 11 applied to the struggles of Napoleon with the papacy, and that the year 1799 marked the end of an era of papal oppression. With that year terminated the limit of papacy's 1260 years of power to oppress, and the time of the end began. That's Thy Kingdom Come, page 48. He thus believed that papal power arose in AD 539 with very little justification, and that the time, times, and half a time, mentioned in Daniel 12 verse 7, referred to 1260 days, that is 1260 years, starting in AD 539 and ending in 1799, the limit of papacy's power to oppress. The 1290 days of Daniel 12 verse 11 equaled 1290 years, dating again from AD 539 and thus ending in 1829, in which year a second Adventist group under William Miller was organized in the United States. This group prophesied that the presence of Christ and the establishment of the kingdom would take place in 1844. Well, the first calculation was 1843, and then that went by and they recast it to 1844, which was then called the Great Disappointment. In contrast with these foolish virgins who could not wait for the Lord's full revelation, the wise virgins under Russell applied to themselves the words of Daniel 12, verse 12. Happy is the one who is keeping in expectation and who arrives at the 1335 days. Counting again from AD 539, 1335 days as equaling 1335 years brings us to 1874. Around which time the Witnesses movement was just beginning, and more important, Russell believed, Christ's invisible presence as King of the kingdom began. It should be said here that they didn't think that the kingdom had come really until 1878, 3.5 years later, even though the presence had begun in 1874. After 1874, there would then be a harvest period of 40 years when all the saints would be called and chosen, until the overthrow of the professedly Christian kingdoms, really kingdoms of this world, and the full establishment of the kingdom of God in the earth after 1914. Notice that, in the earth after 1914. The terminus of the times of the Gentiles. That's Thy Kingdom Come, page 126. I mentioned these ideas of Pastor Russell because the reader can then compare them with the ideas held by the Witnesses today on the same prophecies, since the passage of time has proven Russell wrong. But in making such a comparison, it is surely astonishing that the movement could survive such an upheaval, such a complete reappraisal of its theology. As Matthew Arnold once said, the great Victorian poet, that is, Matthew Arnold once said so truly in his essay Literature and Dogma, quote, to a not small portion of our religious community, a difficulty to the intelligence will for a long time yet be no difficulty at all. End of quote. Certainly under normal circumstances, it would present an insuperable difficulty to the intelligence to find, after some 40 years' affiliation to a religious movement, that the basic ideas were completely unfounded, that Christ had not, after all, been invisibly present since 1874, that the time of the end had not begun in 1799, and that 1914 did not mean the end of all kingdoms and the translation of the faithful to heaven. But this difficulty was, to the majority of Russell's followers, apparently, as Matthew Arnold put it, no difficulty at all, when Rutherford completely reinterpreted the whole chronological operation, giving a completely new set of dates to fit Daniel's prophecies, to the effect that the time of the end had begun not in 1799, but in 1914, and that Christ had been invisibly present not since 1874, but since 1914, the members of the movement, by and large, accepted it gladly and without a murmur. This acceptance of what was in reality a complete about-face by the society prompts one to wonder what would happen if such an about-face became necessary again. Well, that's a big question for witnesses in the 2020s. For now it is firmly maintained that by the autumn of the year 1975, the Battle of Armageddon will have been fought, and God's new world will have been established. If such predictions turn out to be false, what will be the reaction of the members of the movement this time? I'm quite sure that the society today would have much more difficulty in surviving an upheaval on the scale of that of 1914 to 1918. For one thing, the membership in those days could be numbered in hundreds in a handful of countries. Today, membership is well over 1 million in every country of the world. 1 million, well, that's the mid-60s, so obviously by my time, in the mid-70s, 1975, it was over 2 million, and now it's over 8. For another thing, the followers of Russell in 1914 generally possessed a far greater degree of spirituality than is evidenced in the society today. That's probably very true. And that was true in the 60s, but there's been a decline, of course, a dumbing down even since the 1970s. This is understandable because all the members in 1914 believed that they were of the heavenly calling and applied all the New Testament writings to themselves. They were the saints, the holy ones, and they also believed in what was called character development, the belief that there were certain saving qualities in their self-merit, an idea which Rutherford was later to condemn completely. At death, they believed that they would be resurrected to heaven immediately, so the fulfillment of all the chronological calculations was not so vitally important in that their personal hope of salvation was relatively unaffected. But the position today is, of course, quite different. Today, we have 1 million people whose personal hope of salvation rests completely on the fulfillment of the chronological and prophetic predictions of the society. They believe that they are of the millions now living who will never die. Being of the earthly class, less than 12,000 claim to be of the heavenly calling by partaking of bread and wine at the annual memorial celebration of 1963. Their hope is to pass through the Battle of Armageddon into God's new world in which they will live forever. If these hopes are realized to be ill-founded, and Armageddon does not, after all, take place in this generation, they will have no comfort to draw from the belief that they will be resurrected to heaven at death, as Russell's followers had in 1914. For them, death will be the end, a lapsing into complete unconsciousness. Nor does it seem to me that they possess the necessary spirituality to survive such an upheaval of their hope and faith. For since the New Testament is understood to be addressed primarily to the heavenly class, to the holy ones and faithful brothers in union with Christ, according to Colossians 1, verse 2, much of what it has to say, which exhorts one to the development of a spiritual life, the concept of being born again, for instance, is lost upon them, because they do not believe that it applies to them. That's a great point. And it's, of course, evident now after 1975 that about 1 million people left the movement in the years from 1975-76 through to the early 80s. They were, of course, replaced because of the zeal of the organization getting the work going they were replaced, but more people were lost apparently in that 5 to 6 year period than had been Jehovah's Witnesses for the previous 4 generations. I'll put in a link to what 7 predictions did Charles Taze Russell make about 1914, and also to the playlist of which that is a part. Have Jehovah's Witnesses ever been God's organization? See you next time.